Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to a new Star Wars lore video. Today we'll be covering the history of clone and stormtroopers in both Star Wars canon and Legends. Now, as I've been doing recently, I will also be streaming some Fall of the Republic, a brand new Clone Wars mod for Empire at War, probably about an hour or so after this video. So if you want to see me kill some clone troopers because I'm playing as the CIS, head over to my second channel X2. I'll put a link down in the description and in a pinned comment. So here's the plan for today's video. I'll go over the different eras of clone/stormtroopers in a chronological fashion, first looking at Legends, but then later taking a quicker look at Star Wars canon. Now, I've got a lot of topics to touch in today's video, so I'll be covering everything pretty quickly. If there's something you'd like me to look at with more depth, please do not hesitate to let me know down in the comments. Also, for today's video, we'll be skipping any of the pre-Clone Wars era troopers used by the Republic, partially because that's way too much content for one video, but mostly because there's not the same sort of continuity as there is between clone troopers and stormtroopers. What do I mean by that? Well, let's get started. After the Ruusan Reformation, the Galactic Republic largely demilitarized, or at least moved responsibility for defense to individual systems and planets, as the military was largely decentralized. The Republic itself as a central authority was mostly concerned about peacekeeping, and had no real standing navy or army. So, with the start of the Clone Wars, the responsibility for defending the galaxy fell to, well, clone troopers. The clones had been commissioned by Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, who had been manipulated by Plagueis and Palpatine, who played on Sifo Dyas' fear of a crumbling Republic. The order was submitted 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. Humans were chosen as the base for the clone, and bounty hunter Jango Fett was eventually picked to be the template. I've covered why Kamino cloning was so good, especially when compared to other methods in prior videos, so I'm not going to focus on that in today's video, but I will say that clone troopers were among the best fighters the galaxy had ever seen. They came from a great genetic stock, they received basically the best of the best training from a very young age, and their singular purpose basically was to fight a war. Individual trooper specializations were formed, with Jango Fett and other Mandalorians, remember this is Legends, being personally involved in the training of clone commandos and ARC troopers among others. As the war progressed, clones were continually pumped out, but I would argue that over the war, the main aspects of clone troopers didn't change significantly. However, their armor was upgraded several times, most notably from Phase 1 to Phase 2, and specialized clone groups and trooper types emerged. Clones were really interesting, and they generally operated on a spectrum of obedience. The general rank and file trooper was obedient to pretty much all orders, but still able to fight creatively, while special forces squads, especially ARC troopers, were given far more freedom. Troopers were encouraged to personalize their armor, they took nicknames, and fought valiantly and successfully throughout the Clone Wars. However, towards the end of the conflict, Palpatine introduced new templates and cloning methods, meaning both that clones were grown on places other than Kamino and were of different quality, and that some were based on other templates rather than Jango Fett. This takes us to the post-Order 66 order and the formation of the Empire. The Empire moved heavily away from clone individuality as the Stormtrooper Corps was formed. The earliest Stormtroopers were simply clones put into a slightly new role, but pretty quickly things would change significantly. Stormtroopers were the face of the Empire. They were meant to represent its overwhelming force as a body of faceless and infinite killers. However, in fact, Stormtroopers were relatively rare, and especially later on in the war, you'd be much more likely to run into a standard army or navy trooper. The earliest Stormtroopers were simply Kamino clones put into a slightly new role. However, after the rebellion of the Kamino cloners, the Stormtrooper Corps instead would be dominated by clones grown through other methods which were typically much less effective than Kaminoan cloning, resulting in a lesser trooper. The Empire, however, was now also basing their clone troops off an even broader array of templates. We saw this a bit towards the end of the Clone Wars, but by now standout recruits were being selected for cloning. But that recruits thing is really key there, because at this point, the Empire was relying more and more on forced conscription, and the Stormtrooper Corps was being made up largely of regularly born humans. Between that and the lesser cloning methods now being employed, the effectiveness of the Stormtrooper Corps was quite diluted. Arguably though, that was an acceptable price to pay, as the Empire wasn't really fighting a traditional war like the Republic was. Instead, they were focused largely on policing and quashing rebellions, through, as I said, the threat of overwhelming and infinite force. Aside from the increasingly non-clone makeup of Stormtroopers, not much changed until after the Battle of Endor, which we'll touch on in just a second. However, as the war progressed, more and more elite Stormtrooper units did emerge. The Empire arguably moved even further into heavily experimental fighting forces, relying on, for example, more extreme types of training, resulting in Royal Guards, which were picked from Stormtroopers, or new or rare technology, like we saw with the Dark Trooper program, which was initially designed to keep aging clones in fighting shape, and sometimes we even saw the use of the dark side of the Force. But that takes us to our next era, which is the post-Endor Empire. The Empire at this point was not the dominant force in the galaxy, and that's reflected perhaps more clearly than anywhere in the Stormtrooper Corps. The Empire was also dominated by factionalism. There wasn't one unified empire anymore. There were dozens, perhaps even more, smaller imperial factions. While it's true there was arguably one main imperial successor state, we saw the emergence of warlords and pretenders to the throne. Many of these wannabe rulers attempted to model themselves after the Empire, relying on its aesthetic to try to remind people of its fear and authority. So we see most warlord groups use stormtroopers, albeit usually of a lesser quality. Generally, especially the longer-lived warlords would have some troops that would come with them, but almost all needed to secure new assets as they lost various battles, especially due to Imperial infighting. We also saw newly specialized units like Warlord Zinja's Raptor Squad, which were basically stormtrooper variants not tied to the old Empire. Thrawn himself, arguably leading a legitimate Imperial faction, also turned more heavily to clones, using the Sparti method and even integrating secret clone sleeper cells across the galaxy. However, as I mentioned, this period was dominated by Imperial decline, and as the Empire went down the drain, so too did stormtroopers. We see on big capital ships, even important ones like the Chimera, that young recruits and even conscripted officers just out of training would be forced into key positions. Well, the exact same thing happened to stormtroopers. Exaggerating this issue was the fact that stormtroopers existed as a symbol as much as a fighting force, so they needed to be present and in numbers for every Imperial warlord and faction. However, we still do have elite stormtrooper units, and what's more, stormtroopers who had served under the original Empire were now causing some problems for the New Republic. For example, the Sovereign Protector, Karnor Jax, opposed the New Republic as a wannabe Sith Lord, and for those who don't know, Sovereign Protectors are basically elite royal guards who themselves are elite stormtroopers. We also have, for example, Grodin Tierce, who was involved in the events of the Thrawn duology. Still, with the loss of the Reborn Emperor, the mismanagement of the Imperial fleet by Dala, the losses sustained during the Arinda campaign, and 1,000 smaller events, the Empire eventually was forced to make peace with the New Republic and accepted its place as a secondary faction within the galaxy. Imperial stormtroopers, however, would support the New Republic during the Yuuzhan Vong War, and the Empire worked far more closely with the Galactic Alliance that emerged afterwards. This takes us into a new era, which I'll call the Pelion Era, because in the subsequent piece, the Remnant was led by Gilad Pelion. Pelion eventually learns that the Empire he idolized, especially after Endor, never really existed, and as Supreme Commander of the Imperial forces, focused instead on creating an empire which maintained the focus on order and a powerful centralized government, while minimizing the elements of sexism, xenophobia, and cruelty that dominated Palpatine's empire. The new stormtroopers of the this era thus saw aliens enter the ranks, as clones now fell almost totally out of use given the loss of cloning facilities and infrastructure across the galaxy. This takes us into what I'll call the Legacy Era, and after Pelion's death, the Empire was ruled by Jagged Fel. Jag was initially given control of the Empire after the death of Pelion, and although he actually gave up the position of head of state during the Fate of the Jedi series, sometime afterward he returned and assumed the position of Emperor. This takes us far into the future with the Legacy Era, nearly 100 years later. The Empire, which was still ruled by the Fel dynasty and called the Fel Empire, had been at peace with the Galactic Alliance for nearly the entire time, but partnered with a Sith group, the One Sith, and declared war on the GA, which they eventually won. By this point, the Stormtrooper Corps was more than just a symbol and was again probably one of the most powerful fighting forces in the galaxy. However, the Sith turned against the Empire and was able to establish itself as the ruling force in the galaxy. With the split of the Sith Empire and the Fel Empire, Stormtroopers went to both sides of the conflict, but especially as the Emperor Roan Fel, who was thought assassinated, reappeared, many Stormtroopers chose to side with the arguably more legitimate successor to the Empire. Stormtroopers of this era were basically the exact same. There's not even detail about them in the Legacy Era sourcebook, which is disappointing. However, they did have better weapons and armor. That now takes us to canon, and I'm going to be very quick here. After the fall of the Empire, Imperial Stormtroopers still continued to serve for various groups and remnants across the galaxy. However, it wasn't until the emergence of the First Order that Stormtroopers were once again a dominant fighting force in the galaxy. First Order Stormtroopers were largely indoctrinated children, which was an attempt to ensure the highest level of devotion possible, something previously seen only in clones. Speaking of clones, it is worth noting that everything I just talked about regarding clones may or may not be canon. There are too many differences for me to cover in this video alone. However, as the First Order Resistance War was waging, Palpatine on Exegol was also secretly creating his final order with the help of the Sith Eternal Cultists. Here is where we see the Sith Trooper emerge. And this is interesting to me. If you look at the visual dictionary, almost every Sith Eternal officer or Sith Trooper is quite young, under 30 specifically. So that leads me to believe that Palpatine actually started creating this army after his death at Endor. Sith Troopers especially were not only as skilled and dedicated as their First Order counterparts, but loyal not only to the Empire, but the Sith Order itself, which is, I think, unique for them. But guys, this video is getting long and that's all I have to say, so let me know what you think. Which Stormtrooper variant is your favorite? Do you prefer the progression in Legends or canon? One thing I will say, I think it's a little disappointing that the Legacy Era plays it kind of safe, especially where we have cool things like the Imperial Knights, but again, I'm looking to hear your opinion. Anyway guys, that's all I have for you. As always, have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. Check out my stream over on X2, which should be starting quote unquote soon, and as always, may the Force be with you.